Thank you, Carmen.
Happy to help.
Yes. Charge the house for, part of your hours,
Going
right?
right?
Yeah, you're going right. Yeah, well, hey, good afternoon, everybody. It is a very exciting day for us here in the Oklahoma House of Representatives here at the Capitol. Today, we passed overwhelmingly and with bipartisan support the General Appropriations Bill for the state of Oklahoma for the next fiscal year. This legislation passed the State Senate on Tuesday, passed the House, again, overwhelmingly today, and it's the budget as laid out last Wednesday in the press conference jointly by the governor and myself, as well as the Senate leadership. And so just really thrilled, and the session's in a great place. Look, ultimately, the GA bill is the most important part when you talk about, that is the one thing we constitutionally are required to do in the legislature. As we were discussing in the elevator earlier today, I view it as the Christmas tree. That is the budget. You have to have the base of the Christmas tree. Then, of course, there are a lot of ornaments that go on Christmas trees, which are the 100 plus other bills that make up the state budget for the state of Oklahoma. For instance, the limits bill for the State Department of Education and how they're going to allocate money for the Strong Readers Act, how the State Department of Health is going to allocate the funds we've appropriated them, how the Healthcare Authority is going to allocate their funds. So over the course of the next couple of weeks, the legislature is going to keep diving into those bills as it's tied directly to the budget. And of course, continuing to work through the policy bills that are before us in the legislature today as the members of the House continue to work through their policy committees and subcommittees. So with that, we're in a really great place, but excited to have the budget off of our House floor this afternoon.
As far as the timeline, can you just talk about why you guys felt it was important? The deal was announced last Wednesday. 8 days later, you guys have passed it. So why was it important to get that done this week?
Absolutely. So typically in budget agreements, they get announced on like a Monday, and then the language drops that night, if not the next day, and then legislation is passed in less than a week. So I would say the abnormal part of our budget announcement and then the culmination of us actually passing a GA bill off the opposite chamber floor is that we spent more time drafting the GA bill from the time of an announcement, public announcement, to the bill being heard on the floor than what we normally do. But again, as I've said previously, I think in prior years, we've had situations where this time of the legislative session, the leaders in both chambers and the governor knew how the budget was going to end the last week of May. It just, games got played to draw things out until the very end. And this year we said, we're not going to play those games. Look, let's work together collaboratively, find a budget that's good for the state of Oklahoma. Let's get it passed, and then we can continue on about the people's business with all the other pending legislation that is before us. You know, the Senate, they sent us a couple hundred bills from their chamber that we're continuing to vet and go through on our side in the committee process. We sent a few hundred bills over to the Senate that they're going through in their committee process. And so there's a lot happening at the Capitol, and by finishing the budget on this date, early in April, it also has an added benefit for our state agencies because our fiscal year for the state of Oklahoma begins July 1st. Oftentimes for state agencies, if the budget is not finalized until the final week in May, those agencies, they then have 1 month to make adjustments to what their budget looks like and then the ultimate budget that they're going to have to adopt. Trace, I hope in that photo you got Josh in it. He'll be upset if you didn't. So, yeah, just make sure. That's why he hung it back there. But ultimately, so having the budget done early, it ensures that our agency directors have time to set their budgets in a way that is helpful and healthy and deliberative about that. And as Chairman Caldwell said on the House floor, this year's budget process began on July 15th of last year. So pass the budget today. Agency directors, they'll have a new fiscal year beginning July 1st. And then July 15th of this summer, we'll begin the process all over again for the FY28 budget.
Do you feel like this kind of set a precedent that it can be done quickly and, hoping to do that in future years?
Certainly. I had a state senator came up to me last week and said, hey, why don't we do this every year? I said, well, we can. There's no reason we can't. I mean, ultimately, if we know the things and the priorities and where we want to go, we can certainly work collaboratively through the process. And again, that does not mean that we're going to agree about everything, because we don't. And frankly, it wouldn't be good government if we did. We work collaboratively together to come up with solutions that are good for the people of Oklahoma.
The GA bill is what is advanced. When we say, I think typically the budget,
Yes.
right, we still have a large chunk of that we have not seen at all.
Yes.
What is the timeline on that? What is the plan on that? Is there any effort to get more transparency on that than we had by getting the budget revealed on Easter Sunday afternoon?
So two things. You mentioned Easter. You missed my Christmas tree analogy I was saying earlier, but the budget is the Christmas tree, and then you have all the ornaments that go on the Christmas tree, which are the 100 plus other bills that go onto the GA bill that you have to pass first and most importantly. And so I would push back. Certainly the language of the GA bill itself came out over the weekend, but ultimately the language matched what we had put on our House Transparency portal and we had publicly stated the Wednesday before in language. But ultimately the process, that is the appropriations team in the House and the Senate. I know they have been working on what that language looks like, also collaboratively with the governor's office on those bills. And I would be hopeful. I would love to see all those bills ran through on Monday in JCAB, but that just is really a timing mechanism and a question for the appropriations team if they have all the language lined up and ready to go in the way that it needs to be. I'm hopeful that it will be, but I haven't asked whether it will be or not. We've been focused on the GA bill.
Well, what's still being negotiated? I mean, I know there's conversations about Medicaid, I know there's conversations about TSET reset, like what are we not seeing that's going on behind the scenes?
Sure. I would say the pieces of, ultimately, when you have a budget agreement, you, as legislative leaders in both chambers and the governor, you have an agreement conceptually to the framework of a deal. Obviously, always the details work themselves out through the process. I mean, use an example from last year, we agreed on business courts, that was going to be part of the budget agreement. But when we agreed on a budget, we did not have the language already agreed to on what business courts would look like. So over the course of the next several weeks, we whittled it down to the language we ultimately passed last year, which the Supreme Court struck down. And so it's not too different this year. You mentioned Medicaid, property tax, currently, or Medicaid and TSET. Currently, both of those measures are sitting over in the Senate. And so, but ultimately any changes they would potentially make would be done in concert with us. There was talk about them potentially hearing those joint resolutions on Medicaid today. I think they're kind of holding off until next week and continuing conversations. And so, I'm always, of course, going to be open to conversations, but anything we do is going to be collaboratively with the Senate as well as the governor on those fronts. But ultimately on Medicaid, to quote Scott Fettgutter, I've been a broken record about this. The fact that we as legislators, we need more tools in the toolbox to be able to address the unknown as Medicaid costs continue to spike in future years.
You mentioned property tax.
Yes.
You had some conversation, I think, private meetings yesterday about that. Where are you?
Yeah, so we'll continue to have conversations. I've had meetings with, I've had many conversations with the Senate, meetings with the governor, governor's team, and also meeting with stakeholders because I want to make sure whatever we do, we are aware of the impact of ultimately what we want to do. The Senate, of course, sent us SJR 39, which I'm the House author of. I think that's a great legislation on slowing the growth of property tax valuations, but we're also looking at the legislation that the House has passed as well related to the senior property freeze as well as natural disaster relief. Representative Smith passed that legislation, which I think is an important conversation. And so while that's not an issue for most Oklahomans, until it is, if it is an issue, it is a big issue. And so one of the things that we've talked about is having a reprieve for a year on property tax if you lose your home due to a natural disaster, but also potentially having a conversation about if you, say you've lived in your home for 20 years and now you rebuild your house in the same spot, same dimensions, now all of a sudden you get a new tax bill because you have a new home. Well, I believe that if you build a new house that it should be assessed as if it was a continuation of the same house. You shouldn't be punished because of a natural disaster that happened. But so we're having some of those conversations about what does a global package look like on property tax. But I would say that, Medicaid, all those things, I'm hopeful and confident that we'll be able to get those across the finish line next week as we continue to iron them out.
And we're talking about taxes, kind of shifting to the gubernatorial race, there's been a lot of talk of eliminating the income tax and freezing the property tax. Do you think that that would be a good way to retain businesses in the state?
Yeah, so on income tax, I personally wrote the legislation that we passed last year that is the path to zero and negotiated with the governor's team, Senate on that, many late nights, early mornings, long phone calls, negotiating through the nuances of that to make sure we're doing it in a meaningful way that is also responsible. And so we have that path to zero. It is kind of entertaining. Some of the gubernatorial candidates, they're out on the stump talking about all the things that they're going to get done next year as governor that we're already doing or have already done. So that's just kind of fun to watch as the Speaker of the House. But I do appreciate actually when they do that, they're championing some of the things that we've talked about. a lot of the candidates for governor, at least the Republican candidates for governor, have been championing reading, and so that gives me a lot of hope and excitement, frankly, because it is essential that not only do we pass reading legislation this year, but that we have it for the long haul. So I am very excited about the fact that the leading candidates for governor, the Republican ones at least, are supportive of reading initiatives and reforms. And I'm hopeful that by doing that, that gives us some assurances that the reforms we're making this year, the next governor are going to ensure they stay for the following 8 years.
Do you have more details on what the 60 million for reading and math package could include and what that will cover yet?
Yes. So ultimately, I'm going to talk about the reading piece first. So right now, we fund $17.5 million through the Strong Readers Act formula. And current statute, there's a perverse incentive to not help kids get better at reading. Now, I'm not going to claim or say that school districts are intentionally keeping kids behind in order to get more money, but that is the way our formula is structured. That the $17.5 million is split amongst school districts based on your students that are on Tier 2 reading. And all students are at least Tier 1, which, learning how to read. But Tier 2 means you need some additional support and you're behind in reading. And so the way our current formula works, you are funded based on the number of students on Tier 2. Student comes off of Tier 2, gets better at reading, and goes to Tier 1, you lose your SRA money. That is a problem. So what we are doing is we are substantially increasing the SRA funding formula to the tune of $43.5 million. So that's a 1.5x increase, more than doubling it. And we're changing the formula in such a way that 40% of the funds go to Tier 1 students, because it does cost money to educate all kids, so we want to make sure all students are receiving funds. 30% goes to Tier 2 and Tier 3, so students that need additional assistance and to get caught up in reading. And then 30% is in an incentive fund. So what we want to do is reward school districts. If you're doing a good job and your students can't read or are behind in reading, and you have shown you have effective programs and you're doing a good job, the state should reward you for that, for doing the right thing and helping our kids. So that's the biggest piece of it. Additionally, I do not have the math number off the top of my head, but the same piece is the math funding to create a numeracy funding formula where it will be similar to the way the SRA is situated, where it will run through the formula and assist school districts. So last year we passed strong numeracy legislation, and that goes into effect this fall. So if we do not have a math funding formula, then that would be an unfunded mandate. So we're funding math and substantially increasing the funding to reading this year.
I think I heard Caldwell talk about it on the floor a little bit. SRO funding, we were contacted by some the officers who were told that the grant fund is ending June 30th of this year. They're kind of worried that they're going to lose your job. Not that you know everything about this, but do you know, I know the 50 million is on the portal, but is that going to help them keep that funding in this year?
I appreciate that question. It's a very timely question too. And I have fantastic news. We just funded that in the budget we passed today. All the members that voted in favor of the budget voted to continue the SRO funding. Members that voted against it didn't vote to support the SRO funding.
They're good after June 30th.
Yes, it's a $50 million. So what we did a couple years ago is we set aside $150 million for a 3-year grant for SRO funding for $50 million a year, was the way it was structured. Pilot program has been successful, and so what we did this year is we made that increase permanent, and part of the base of the budget with a $50 million recurring increase to the budget to fund those SRO grants in perpetuity.
Wasn't the pilot program, though, a bit of a piece of contention that I think it's, $92,000 per school district to break it down? And, again, not to make it specifically about the Pauls Valley situation, but if you take a school, Roth Public Schools, they have one school, $92,000 pays for one SRO. That SRO can be at that school 24/7 every day. Evan Public Schools, Oklahoma City Public Schools, they get $92,000. They hire 1 or 2 people. They have 20 school sites. So has there been any further discussion? Obviously, maybe too late for it this year, but has there been further discussion? Because I think even Pauls Valley Public Schools has multiple school sites, and there's only one SRO funded through that. So how did that play into it? Because that was a part of the concern 3 years ago.
Sure. So first on Pauls Valley, that principal is a hero, an absolute hero, full stop, and should absolutely be commended for what he did by putting himself in harm's way to save kids, and cannot say enough good things about what that man did, and we should praise him, and we should be telling his story from the rooftops for a long time. on the SRO funding, I mean, you're correct. The funding is equal across school districts. Now, the challenge, what I would push back and say for an Edmond Public Schools or Broken Arrow Public Schools or those larger school districts, they already have SRO officers. Prior to 3 years ago, they have additional funding because they are a larger school. They have a larger school district. They have the scalability of being so large that they have those resources. So it's really our smaller school districts that are the ones that do not have the capacity and the resources to contract or hire SRO employees. And so by passing this in such a way that it does spread it all out across the state in an equal way, it really allows our rural school districts, our smaller school districts to be able to participate while not excluding the Edmonds of the world and allowing them to continue to participate as well to have those SROs.
Can you talk a little bit about some of the objections we've heard to the budget resolution? Some of the Republicans talked about it not really representing conservative values because we're spending more after all. And some of the Democrats said we're putting some money into places where it shouldn't go and not investing enough in people's needs.
Look, I don't want to speak overly broad about the Democrats because we did have at least a couple of Democrats who voted for the budget, maybe more than two, but I saw two for sure voted for the budget. So we had bipartisan support. But for some members of the minority caucus, they always want to spend more money. It's never enough. And then when we save money, they want to spend the money. And then when we try to save money, they gripe at us about saving the money. So I just, they're in the minority. I get it. Their job is to oppose things as part of the process. When Republicans were in the minority in the 90s, Republicans opposed things. But ultimately, the members that you saw in the minority caucus who supported the budget, that's because they decided to get involved. I think there were some members during debate who said it very well. The members who were involved in the budget and chose to be involved, you saw they supported the budget. If you decide you don't want to be involved or you don't like some things in the budget, no, I don't like some things in the budget. But no, the budget's not perfect because it's a negotiation. Ultimately, we have 99 currently members of the House. We have 2 vacancies, 48 senators and the governor. And so no one person gets everything they want, but it's a negotiation, and it's a really good budget. I mean, as for some of the criticisms from some members of the Republican caucus, look, ultimately, some of the criticism was about savings, and it is very conservative to have savings. The suggestion from one of the members that was debating against the bill today that we should not have state savings is irresponsible, frankly, because do any of us in our personal budgets not have some savings held back for a rainy day? If you don't, you should. And so for anyone to suggest that a state government or any government entity should not have some surplus set aside for a rainy day, that's an irresponsible assertion. And that's why you saw the overwhelming majority of the Republican caucus support this bill, because it is a conservative budget, it's a good budget, and it's great for the people of Oklahoma.
What are some things in the budget that you don't like?
Well, there's some things that could be more, some things that could be less.
In the Senate earlier today, they rejected a special provision to House Joint Resolution 1024 that would have made changes to the Judicial Nominating Commission. Now that vote will be reconsidered in the Senate. But I mean, do you see a similar outcome on the Medicaid Joint Resolution?
What did they reject exactly? Sorry, I have not seen this yet.
There were 2 votes on House Joint Resolution 1024, one to just pass it that passed along party lines, and then the second vote was that special provision to get it to the August ballot, and that was rejected because it needed 2/3
Okay.
of the vote. And now Gallagher made a motion to have that reconsidered,
Okay.
but I'm wondering if that will also happen to Joint Resolution 1067 Medicaid, TSET resolution. Wondering what you think.
Yeah, so this is breaking news to me in the moment that happened in the Senate. So, that often happens in the legislature. You come up short of the 2/3 you need, you vote to reconsider. And so, I'm hopeful they'll get it across the finish line when it comes up again next week. Ultimately, I think it's a better outcome for voters to kind of split some of these votes out. So some are in November, some are in August. And so we don't have ballot fatigue and all of these state questions on the November ballot that are already going to be inundated with all the general elections that are going on. So, I'm hopeful the state Senate could get that on the August ballot. But ultimately, it's in their purview unless and until they send it to us.
But they said, Gallagher said the goal is for Republican leadership to put everything on the August ballot if possible. That sounds like that would be voter fatigue and just inherently there's fewer Democratic runoffs. Independents like myself don't typically get to vote in any, or this year don't get to vote in any primaries or runoffs. So
Change your registration to Republican.
you haven't done anything that would make me do that. In fairness, neither have the Democrats. But I mean, if you don't want to have everything on November, how do you justify having everything on August? Or is that not your position? That's just
Yeah, well, I think there will ultimately likely be some state questions that end up on November, just like there are some in August. If they were to all get on August, I do see the advantage of that, just because then on the August ballot it is much cleaner. It's mostly going to be state questions and any potential runoffs the Democrats or Republicans may have. And then in the general election, of course, all the general elections. So I do think it helps ballot fatigue, even if the bulk and majority of the state questions were in August instead of November.
there was pretty poor turnout on Tuesday for a lot of local school board elections. I'm curious. I believe the Senate has tried to change that, and I don't believe it passed in the House. What were your thoughts on the local turnout?
Yeah, so the election calendar is something that we revised last year. We reduced the number of elections. I believe at one time there were 12 plus different dates that elections could be held on, and last year the legislation, some years it's 4, some years it's 5 different elections, and so we reduced that last year, and so we're just now getting into the cycle of that, and so I'm hopeful in future years as that becomes more well known about, essentially this is your election for the first quarter, the second quarter, third quarter, fourth quarter of the year. It can be more well known that will help. I filed some legislation similar on that. Of course, that didn't advance on the House side, so just because you're Speaker of the House doesn't mean all your bills get heard. But I had legislation that would have moved the primary elections in 2028 to March to align with the presidential primaries. That ultimately didn't appear to have the support necessary to get it through this year at least. But I do believe this speaks to the value of aligning the calendar and having fewer election dates. Well, thank you all. Hope you have a great rest of your Thursday.